I'm Alex Larson, dietitian, Ironman finisher, and host of Endurance Eats, the podcast where we break down the science of endurance nutrition and turn it into clear, practical nutrition advice to revolutionize how you think about fueling your body. So grab a seat, or keep moving if you're out training, and let's get started. Hello, welcome back to the Endurance Eats podcast. Fueling your training and races with carbs is crucial, but an area where I also see a lot of room for improvement for athletes is with hydration and electrolytes. You may be leaving some performance potential on the table. I met today's guest, Lexi Kelson, at a sports nutrition conference in Kansas City, and I'm really excited to have her here today with the goal of providing you with some very tangible and applicable advice in how to improve your hydration and electrolyte strategies. Lexi is a registered dietitian. She earned her master's degree in applied nutrition with a focus on fueling for sports performance. She wears a few hats at Precision Fuel and Hydration. She conducts sweat tests out of Atlanta, Georgia. She travels for pro sports teams with testing gigs. With a background in journalism, she's able to combine her skills with both words and science to write evidence-based blogs on their Knowledge Hub, create educational content, and strategize fuel and hydration plans for athletes. While she's not an endurance athlete herself, she is a power lifter, very cool, who can allegedly be persuaded to run a 5K every so often. Are you ready for this? Let's get started. Hey, Lexi, thanks for being here today. I'm really excited for us to chat all things hydration and electrolytes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, I just want to get right to it. Let's talk about what we know based on the research when it comes to hydration, electrolytes for endurance athletes, because there is a certain sports fuel company. I don't want to drop the T here, but it rhymes with Schwartz. And I've spoken with their reps a couple times where I've said, I love your products. I've used them. I've recommended them, but there's very little sodium in them. And for salty sweating athletes like myself, it's really hard to use exclusively their products and meet athletes' really high electrolyte needs.
Mm-hmm.
And their response every time is well, the research doesn't really back up needing sodium. To which my face is just huh? I just kind of disagree with that. I feel like we do have evidence that's come out saying that we need to replenish electrolyte losses in endurance style events. And I wanted to just get your initial thoughts on this, Lexi.
That's so frustrating that, if let's say you really like a product and you're trying to use all their stuff and then it doesn't have one of the key components of race nutrition strategy. We know that when you're sweating, you are losing electrolytes, and a large proportion of that is coming from sodium. And just knowing all the important factors of sodium and all the things that it does in the body. I mean, it's involved in muscle contraction. We see it affecting cramping a lot. Cognition. You're making sure that you're able to stay focused on your race, especially when you're doing a 10-hour endurance event. Your brain needs to be functioning as much as possible.
Yeah, even like a 4-hour marathon, if it's really hot and humid out and you're sweating excessively, we see people in the med tent all the time because of those issues.
Yeah, and I mean, sodium plays a role in nutrient absorption. So maybe you're struggling to hit your fuel numbers, and maybe part of that is because you're not hitting the right ratio of sodium to replenish your losses. So there's so many important factors about sodium. And then, we have seen research that shows that it is impactful and helpful to have sodium replenishment. There's a study that we always kind of go back to that's from 2015 of athletes replacing the sodium loss in their sweat that, these athletes did finish a middle distance triathlon, so not even the full distance. They're finishing an average of 26 minutes faster than those who weren't replacing the sodium lost in their sweat. So, that's one study, but there are plenty of studies that are, showing the impact of sodium. And so to completely discount it you can see a lot of athletes anecdotally who have had massive improvements in their race performance and not having to end up in that medical tent, because what happens when they get to the medical tent? They're giving them a saline solution with sodium. So if you can prevent getting to that medical tent, that goes a long way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you go to Kona, they weigh yourself actually before the race so that they can kind of accurately estimate like how dehydrated athletes
Absolutely.
are when they end up in the med tech. I mean, that's how serious it is. So for you, when Precision Hydration is working with athletes on their fuel and hydration plan, what are some of the most common issues that you see athletes initially like reporting? And then like, what are you seeing like the gaps in their fueling and hydration?
Yeah, one of the biggest things is definitely cramping. Cramping is such a common thing, unfortunately, that a lot of people do struggle with. Cramp is one of those tricky things that is multifaceted. So there are so many elements involved that could be influencing it. But one element that is often a factor is sodium replenishment and or your fluid replenishment. So your hydration strategy. So if someone comes to me that, is really struggling with cramping, maybe it's even full body cramping, further they get into a race, especially in the heat, and they say they're a really heavy sweater, that's when we want to figure out, okay, how much sodium are you taking in and how much are you losing in your sweat? So let's say they do have a pretty high sweat sodium concentration. We're able to figure that out from a sweat test. Then we can say, okay, so for every 32 ounces of fluid or every liter of fluid that you're consuming, we want this ratio of sodium in that fluid to make sure that you are accounting for all that you're sweating out. And I will say, anecdotally, the people that we've been able to work with and help and implement this type of strategy, the cramping, a lot of times it, goes away and it does help. And they're able to still stay, as hydrated as possible throughout the race. And even for those long endurance races, even by the end, they're able to stay cramp free.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well, is whenever I meet with an athlete, initially I'll ask, like, do you have a history of cramping issues? Because I'm trying to figure out what are all the struggles that they're having, what are their goals, what's the struggles in there, and like, where can we nutritionally and with hydration and electrolytes dial things in to make sure that on race day that they don't have those major issues that can impede performance and they can really potentially see that goal of like a PR or a qualifying time.
Absolutely. I mean, the hydration strategy, the sodium aspect is so important. And then there's also the fluid aspect that a lot of people aren't used to taking in very much fluid at all. So really working with them to figure out how much fluid they are losing. So measuring sweat rate, weigh in, pre and post exercise, and then, slowly increasing that fluid intake to make sure that they are able to get in enough fluid to mitigate that really extreme dehydration that's going to affect their performance.
Yeah. I feel like especially with runners, they're like, oh, I'll just drink something before, maybe after my long run, and they'll kind of call it a day. Or even with cyclists, like, oh, I brought a water bottle with, like, it's fine. Like to them, that's just like, they'll replenish those losses afterwards. But I find there's two things that I explain to them of why we need to like have a good rehydration strategy in training. One is the better hydrated we can keep them throughout their workout, the better performance they're going to see, because when they get dehydrated, their heart is going to have to work harder to maintain that effort because there's less like blood volume. The other thing is just like practicing drinking enough. I'm thinking of like my cyclists who will forget, they'll get in the zone on the bike and they'll just like forget to drink. It's really easy on race day because there's so many things going on in your head. You're like navigating traffic. Like there's all like strategy of when you're going to like, maybe up the pace. And it's really easy to forget. So if you are practicing training after training, staying on top of a really good hydration schedule, then on race day, it's almost second nature for you to like grab that bottle and drink. You don't even think about it. You're just doing it automatically, which makes it so much easier on race day to stay hydrated and perform really well.
There's, the twofold strategy of you're trying to increase your tolerance to maybe more carbs, more fluid, but it's so behavioral as well. And so the more you practice it, it's second nature, like you said.
Yeah, I think that behavioral piece is really, really key. And then the other thing, especially for runners, is they won't hydrate during training, right? And then they get to race day and you have an aid station every 2 miles. And they were like, oh yeah, I'll stay hydrated. I've got this like really easy cup that someone's handing me. I'm going to drink some fluids every 2 miles. And their body isn't, and their body isn't adapted to that, right?
Yeah.
And they get this like sloshy feeling after a while and they feel uncomfortable and then they're slowing down. They just don't feel great. And there was a study, I think it was in 2008, where they looked at runners consuming higher volumes of fluid for, I want to say like 5-6 days. And they had them rate their comfort level of like the contents of it in their stomach. And by that 5th-6th day, that comfort level greatly improved. And so like our body is so adaptable in that way, where it's like especially for runners, we need to make sure that they're practicing consuming those higher volumes so that there's that comfort level at the same time.
Absolutely. And, if you think about doing short training runs, maybe you don't necessarily need, for a short run to have a hydration with you. But if you're practicing it consistently to make sure that by the time race day comes, especially if you have had some of those GI issues, then why not just make it second nature in training? So it's really easy on race day.
I feel like a good chunk of GI issues are stemmed from dehydration.
Oh, absolutely. It totally makes sense of, when your body is dehydrated, that's a massive stressor on your body. And so it's going to try and shut down things that doesn't need, quote, maybe not need to do. So if you are having those digestive issues, it's a great first place to look of, am I really making an effort to stay hydrated from a fluid perspective and, relative sodium concentration as well.
Yeah, that GI system will just shut down if you're getting overheated, if you're dehydrated, if your body's diverting all that blood flow away from the gut to your skin, trying to cool yourself. And so something that I do with my athletes when we're coming up to a race and it's looking like it's going to be really hot and humid, and I'm like, oh boy, this is going to be brutal. I'm like, here's some things to just look out for, like during the race. If you feel like you're drinking and your stomach's just feeling like more and more full and it's not emptying, I was like, I need you to slow way down and get your heart rate down, because we need to get that blood flow back to the gut in order for your stomach to start emptying. Otherwise, they're just going to start vomiting at that point, because there's just no, like, things have stopped moving. That's a key one. Or like looking at electrolytes too. Like there's things that I like to kind of prep them in advance of, like, worst case scenarios. Like you're going to have to slow down and cool down in order for you to be able to, like, keep going. Otherwise, you're going to end up DNFing.
Absolutely. No, that's a great strategy, and that's a great way to approach it.
Okay, so let's talk about signs of dehydration, and then also signs of like low electrolyte levels in athletes, whether it's in training or out on the race course. Like, what are some classic ones where we would be like, yeah, we gotta like start to course correct here?
Yeah. So, the GI issues, like we talked about, can definitely be a sign. Cramping, huge one. Overall, like excessive fatigue. Let's say you've been staying on top of your fueling strategy, but you're still just really struggling with fatigue. Lightheadedness, dizziness, that cognitive function, like the confusion. Those can all be signs of dehydration, especially from a relative sodium concentration standpoint. Increased heart rate can be one. Massive dry mouth. You just can't seem to quench your thirst. You're drinking a ton of water, but still can't quench your thirst. That could be a sign that maybe you're taking in enough total fluid, but you're taking in not nearly enough sodium, because your body is saying, cool, we still need more electrolytes. We're still thirsty, but it's more the sodium that you need versus more fluid. Those are all definitely big signs.
Yeah, I find, and this is like, I look back at myself, 10 years ago when I was doing Ironman Wisconsin, and what we knew about, nutrition 10 years ago is very different to what we know now. And what we had available for sports products was very limited. I just drank regular Gatorade, like on the race course, and I had a bottle of water. And I just think about how much different I would be if I was doing Ironman like next week, how differently my nutrition and hydration and electrolyte strategy would look like. But I peed like 4 times during that bike race, and I was just thinking about like, oh, it's probably just because I was not getting enough electrolytes. I wasn't actually like retaining those fluids. I was just kind of triggering urine output. I just find that just so fascinating, like knowing what we know now and looking back like on my own.
It's so interesting. It almost makes you think of, okay, what else are we going to know in 10 years? I always think, what are we doing now that is going to be even better 10 years from now, because we've learned so much in the past 10 years. And sodium's definitely been one of those things that's it's really improved in the past, the education around it in the past 10 years.
In early 2024, I met with your guys as sports scientists, and I was just very impressed. It was my network of sports dietitians who I was asking some electrolyte questions and sweat rate questions, and they all were just saying like precision hydration sweat tests, like their stuff is like legit. And I was like, okay, I need to learn more about what they're doing. And I thought it was really fascinating how your sweat tests work. If you go on Precision Hydration's website, you guys have a little find a test site, little like survey. So you can like,
it's like a little drop down menu.
And you're located in Atlanta. So if any people listening in Atlanta and they want their sweat tested, they can come visit you. Kind of talk through that sweat testing process, because I find it very interesting. Most people assume that they would have to like work out during it and get all sweaty, but that's not actually the case.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because anytime someone contacts me, about a sweat test, they're like, okay, so what gear do I need to bring? How long am I going to be running for? All those questions. And I, love to tell them, all you have to do is really, it's a really easy workout. You just sit in a chair and you talk to me. And they're like, what the heck do I do? So yeah, it's a really cool process. It's a totally passive at rest test. What we do is we put two electrodes on your forearm, stimulate your sweat glands through a method called, and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but pilocarpine iontophoresis. So it's stimulating, wow. Exactly, yeah, it's a mouthful. So it's basically telling your sweat glands that they need to produce a localized sweat response on your forearm. And then once it produces that sweat response, we put a little collector disc basically on top of a spot on your arm, just attach it with some Velcro. And then you sit there and wait for it to fill up the little tube with your sweat. And then once there's enough of a sweat sample in that tube, we pull it out with a little syringe that doesn't go anywhere near your skin. It just goes in the tube. And then feed it through a sweat analyzer machine to figure out how many milligrams of sodium per liter is in there. And it reads it in millimoles, and then we just convert it to milligrams so we can figure out what relative concentration of sodium is in your sweat.
Yes. And I actually did the sweat test. You and I met at a sports nutrition conference in Kansas City back in May. I was so surprised.
You're salty.
I'm still in shock, Lexi. Like I am trying to just I'm just like in denial right now. So I totally thought I would be like average sweat, like saltiness in terms of my sweat, which is around like 1,000 milligrams per liter of sweat is the average of my understanding. I was like 1,700 milligrams of soda. It's so salty because I guess I had never really noticed like a lot of sweat stains on my clothing. But I did actually just look at my hydration vest the other day from some trail running, and I did actually see some like salt on there. I'm like, oh, I missed that.
Yep.
And
are you a really heavy sweater as well?
I have to do some in-home sweat testing, but I feel like I have a tendency to sweat really high. So I need to kind of dial in my own hydration electrolyte needs. Because
that's hard when you're super salty and you're a heavy sweater. It's a lot to think about because it means that you know there's a big liability of, oh no, I am at risk for some of these dehydration symptoms and this impact. So it's kind of like a shock to the system of, oh my gosh, how am I going to make sure I, account for all this?
Yeah. And honestly, every single triathlon that I used to do, I'd always cramp on the run. Like my calves would just cramp up. And I just thought that was like,
so you signed up for, right? Doing an Ironman.
And I'm like, yeah, like people talk about like, it just like, it's easy if your calves cramp up usually initially in the run and then they loosen up along the way. But now I'm just like, oh, dang it. Like it probably was a little bit of a sodium issue.
Yeah.
You live and learn. But I'm still like processing this information, and it's been months since we did that test. I just thought, like, for me, any of our athletes where we suspect they're a salty sweater, I'm like, let's see if we have a precision hydration test near you. Yeah. Are you traveling? As like I've said, some athletes that are up in like Seattle area, and then like they're visiting San Francisco, and I'll have them get hooked up there in San Francisco. And it's just really comforting to have an idea of like, okay, how much sodium on average are we losing per liter of sweat? And then we can learn what people's sweat rate is. They can do just a simple at-home sweat test in different climates. Like they can do like a hot day, a cool day, an easy effort, a hard effort, and we can really understand the variables of their sweat and then understand how much we need to deal with like sodium in that aspect.
Yeah, and that's all the pieces of the puzzle because, thinking about your hydration strategy, yes, you want to drink something. You want to make sure that you're drinking the right strength for you. So those two elements combined, that's your net losses. And if we think about matching input to output, what are we losing and how can we put that back in? And the sweat rate at home, just to weighing yourself in different conditions, then you can really tailor it to say, okay, I'm racing in Kona. It is going to be so hot and humid. I need to make sure that I have enough fluid and electrolytes. And then you turn around and you race, in Colorado in November or something. It's totally different climate. And so your strategy should be different. The relative concentration of sodium is going to still be pretty similar. But the total fluid that you're consuming, that's going to be different because you're not going to be sweating nearly as much in Colorado versus in Kona.
Now, okay, so you mentioned Colorado, and I guess I don't know the answer to this, and I don't know if we've found this in the research, but we know that like at higher altitudes that people lose fluids a lot faster just through like respiration of the air being so dry. Is there additional electrolytes they would lose through that? Because they might not necessarily be losing it through sweat. Do you know that answer?
So as far as from the reading that I've done, it's not that it would change the relative sodium concentration that you need, but there is something to be said for if you're losing more fluid, airing a little bit higher on the sodium concentration side to help you retain more water. If you're not able to, fully recomp your losses, basically. So that may be a factor to consider. If you know that you're really struggling with altitude and maybe you're someone who isn't able to train at altitude very often, and so it's more of an issue for you when you do get up there for a race, going a little bit higher with your electrolyte intake could help you just to hold on to more of the fluid, kind of use that water retention property of sodium to your advantage.
Yeah. And I sometimes feel like we have this like thought process in our head was like more is always better. Like there is there is a point where you can take too much sodium, right? Like I always tell people, I'm like, okay, if you're over consuming electrolytes, like one of the classic signs would be like diarrhea. I mean, is there anything else that we would be concerned about?
Yeah, sometimes like a really extreme puffiness and bloating means that your body may be holding on to too much water. So, you can overdo anything. You're probably more likely to underdo sodium as an endurance athlete specifically, just because of your losses are accumulating hour after hour. But that's not to say that you can't overdo it. And, the key with that is notice if you're really craving plain water. That can sometimes be a sign that that's just the only thing that tastes good. Or maybe you have that extreme edema, that extreme bloating. Look for those signs. And then it's not to take those in and of itself and say, oh, that means I overdid it. You kind of compare that against what you know about your sweat losses and what you have been doing over the course of the race and say, okay, are all these points kind of pointing in the direction of I may have overdone it a little bit. Then you can scale back. But let's say you're massively underdoing sodium based on what you know about yourself and you're feeling kind of swollen and bloated. That may not mean that you're overdoing sodium. It's kind of checks and balances of all the different factors working together.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about rehydration rates. So if you know what your sweat rate is in terms of like sodium loss per liter of sweat, and let's say you have an idea in general of your sweat rate loss, let's say it's around a liter an hour that you're losing, just for simplicity of math. And honestly, like I would say on average, sweat rate loss is around a liter an hour for most athletes. And I've seen some where they're losing like a liter and a half, especially in really warmer conditions, or like some of my female athletes might be more like 0.8, like 3/4 of a liter. So that's typically where I see sweat rates. Though I did have one athlete this past summer who was losing around close to like 1.8 liters an hour in like the heat. And he was doing one of those extreme triathlons. And so the fluid intake of that man during that race was so impressive, but he made it through. I mean, the race was hard, but it was a completely different experience from the year prior for him. So it's not like when you learn your sweat rate, you're trying to like ounce per ounce replace every single thing you're replacing, right? Like what's kind of like your guidelines that you typically recommend?
Yeah. So the goal when we think about avoiding too extreme of dehydration is to avoid that 2 to 4 or to stay within that 2 to 4% body weight reduction. That's kind of where the literature tends to be around. That's, anything more than that can be impactful in a negative way to your performance. That is pretty individual though. Some people can tolerate more dehydration than others. That's kind of an average estimate. So thinking about that, the goal would be to replace 70 to 80% of your fluid losses, which if someone's losing a liter an hour, okay, great. Bare minimum, 700 milliliters an hour, about 800 milliliters an hour, around 24 ounces an hour. That's going to be a really good target. And, if they can comfortably tolerate up to a liter per hour, like their full sweat losses, and it's a hot race, it's not to say that they shouldn't do that. If they can comfortably tolerate it, awesome, assuming they're accounting for the electrolytes in there. But going too far below that 24-ounce mark is going to be where you're putting yourself at risk for dehydration issues.
Yeah, I always tell them to like especially earlier on in their race, like can tolerate a little bit more typically, because
Yeah.
especially those longer distance races, sometimes the stomach and gut just gets a little tired
Oh, yeah.
and fatigued. And so if you've kind of banked things a little bit, you can get
Yep.
away with it a little bit later on in the race when things are just like hard.
Yeah, that front loading strategy is definitely something that we see a lot with triathlon specifically, with, fluid intake and carb intake as well. Just because you're on the race, yeah, you haven't built up as much of cumulative fatigue yet. And just the positioning of going from bike to run, you're able to logistically consume more on the bike versus the run. Everything is jostling around, and the mechanics of that, it's harder to carry stuff. So if you can front load a little bit and kind of skew more of your intake earlier on, that can give you a little bit more of a buffer by the time you hit the later parts.
Yeah, my mantra for my triathletes is the bike is the buffet.
Oh, I love that. Oh, that's good. You need t-shirts with that.
Yes, I do. I need to make like
stickers.
Some Alex Larson nutrition swag that says the bike is the buffet, because it's a really good mantra for them when they're on the bike. They're like, oh, my voice is in their head where like the bike is the buffet. Like they're like eating, they're drinking, because if you can fuel that bike really, really well and stay on top of hydration, then you're going into the run on top of it and you're not behind and trying to catch up. It's really hard on the run to catch up. So yes, you can use my slogan if you
I was going to say, someone needs to come up with like buffet bars, buffet handlebars. There needs to be some kind of product there.
Yes.
Don't steal that, people.
Yes, it's all came from me. But it's like exactly. It's a good way of thinking about it, especially earlier on in the race, because you just can kind of bank that and then be sitting pretty nicely in those longer races. And I will say for like ultra distance races that, you're looking at like 12, 16, 24 hours, especially earlier on in like the hotter part of the days, I'm like trying to get my athletes to 100% replace their hydration, because if you're at like 70% every hour, you're only replacing that, over 5-6+ hours, you're going to be really dehydrated at that point.
Yeah, and if you're dropping off to hour after hour, so maybe you're starting out first hour 80% and then 70, then 60, 50, 40, your average is not going to be that 70 to 80%. So if we, shoot for the average being 70, 80%, start out the full replenishment, knowing it's probably going to drop off later on.
Agreed. Oh my gosh, I feel like people are just like frantically writing down notes during this episode. But I will be including an overview in the show notes here. So it's going to be like, I'm hoping to make just like a cheat sheet for everyone here, because we got so much great information. And I will link the studies that we referenced as well. Okay, so shorter training races, sessions, you can get away with like 70, 80% rehydration. Even like something that's less than an hour, you could bring, just a small amount with, just kind of practice that habitual thing. But then afterwards, I feel like rehydrating almost like 100 to 150% afterwards, just to account for like urine losses, is something that I also try and practice myself and then have my athletes practice.
Absolutely. So that replacing your, the 150% of your fluid losses is definitely a really important factor. If you know you have another training session coming up soon, maybe your losses were just really high for this one. It was really hot. It was really difficult. Or, you've got a race coming up soon, you've been more fatigued, to rehydrate as fast as possible, having that 150% afterwards. Within that first few hours, that's kind of what we see in the research as definitely being kind of the optimal rehydration strategy.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, I want to talk about sodium preloads, because I feel like this is kind of a newer strategy. I don't know if do we have research studies on sodium preloads at all? I feel like I've seen a couple.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we've got some. It's really interesting because people always think about carb loading ahead of a race, which, yes, all for it. Please do it. But there's another element as well. And it's, a different strategy, but it's the same kind of concept as doing something beforehand to make sure that you're preparing your body. So by the time you get to the race, you're not starting out behind. And yes, it's not, the preload is not going to carry you through the whole race, just like your carb load is not going to last you your entire race, but it's going to give you that buffer and make sure that you're not, playing catch up as soon as you start the race.
Yeah. So let's talk about when we say sodium preload, what are we talking about here?
So the research that we see as far as the strategy that's most impactful for increasing blood plasma volume and kind of starting out really hydrated is to have a really stronger electrolyte the night before and the morning of the race is kind of the practical application that we tell athletes to do. So using precision products, it would be the pH 1500 strength. So that's our higher strength electrolyte that has 1500 milligrams of sodium per 32 ounces or per liter.
Yeah, and that's actually 2 tablets. I think that's
Yes.
sometimes confusing for people because they're like, why does it say 750 milligrams on the label? And I'm like, well, that's because one tablet is for 16 ounces. And so you would take, it would be 1500 milligrams per liter. So you would do 2 tablets for a liter of water.
Yes. And it's all about relative concentration. That was kind of like the big, if anyone remembers anything from this episode, relative sodium concentration is what they should remember. Because 1500 milligrams per liter, that is the relative concentration. And that's the stronger strength concentration that is impactful for that preload. You have 16 ounces of water with 750 milligrams of sodium. That's the same, doing a little bit of the math equivalent conversions. It's the same ratio as 1500 milligrams per 32 ounces, but just half of a full serving. So you would do that the night before, and then again the morning of a race, finishing that bottle about an hour before you start the race to make sure that you have time to absorb it and for it to kind of hit your system. And that's the preloading strategy that we recommend.
Empty your bladder as well.
Yes.
Unless you're a triathlete and we pee in the lake or the ocean.
Yeah.
That's the one exception.
That's the exception.
Yeah. And like the night before too, I usually recommend at least an hour, like finishing in an hour before bedtime. So then you have time to kind of empty the bladder. Yes. So you're not up during the night having to pee.
Yeah, absolutely. And, making sure that you do a preloading strategy is definitely so impactful, especially for a triathlon, because you are going to be starting the swim and you can't really do much during the swim. So, making sure that you're starting out hydrated, that carries you through the first leg of the whole race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It just gives you a little head start, especially if you're a salty sweater. Like I feel like it really helps to kind of build up those plasma levels in your blood to give you that little bit of a head start. And I will say even for like athletes that have like a long workout on a Saturday and it's going to be really hot and humid, do that sodium preload.
Oh yeah.
Before that, because it's just going to set you up to feel way better on your long workout. And then for athletes who maybe are struggling with like headaches the rest of the day after their long workouts, that could be a really telltale sign that they might be underfueled or they're underhydrated and not getting enough electrolytes.
Yeah. So the preloading strategy can be also used as like a recovery strategy. Preloading before a long training session, if it's going to be in the heat. I live in Atlanta. It is hot in the summer here.
I don't know how you guys live there. I could never.
It is absolutely miserable. I love Georgia, but oh my word, it is horrible in the summer. So, starting out a session, even if it's a short session, I would want to start that hydrated because it's really hot and I know it's going to be tough. Then on the flip side, from a recovery standpoint, having another round of that, bottle with 1500 in it, that's going to be a really good way to, encourage recovery, encourage rehydration afterwards. So, there's a lot less chance of a cramp or headache or lightheaded dizziness afterwards.
Yeah. I also feel like if you're going to sodium preload before your race and you're going to drink that liter of fluid the day before, I would throw some of that like carb only drink mix that Precision Hydration is in there, just like to give yourself another extra boost of carbs. Since you're already carb loading, and then it's like less food that you'd have to eat during your carb load because it can be so much food when you're carb loading. It can get really filling, and so if you can drink some of your carbs, and you're already going to be drinking that. That electrolytes, that would be just a nice little hack too.
Yeah, that's perfect because carb loading is definitely like, especially if you're someone who tends to get pre-race like nerves in your stomach, or you just have a sensitive stomach overall, and you're not used to eating
that would be
many
me.
carbs.
Like raising my hand here because it doesn't matter if it's just like a fun race. I just like there's some sort of like pre-race jitters, anxiety just kills my appetite in the morning.
I mean, adrenaline definitely can do that. And so if you can use as many easy carb sources as possible. So like the carb only drink mix is a perfect example because you can get a lot of carbohydrate in a liquid drinkable form. And then also I always tell athletes to, use things like honey and maple syrup, or, really dense sources of carbohydrates that are not going to feel like you're eating something. If you're loading up a piece of toast with honey and jam and maple syrup or whatever, and some fruit, that's going to feel way less filling than having 3 slices of bread without any of those condiments on there. So the more energy dense foods you can use in your carb load, it's going to feel way easier, and your stomach's probably going to really thank you for it.
I cannot obsess how much important I think pancakes and syrup are for like before a long workout or a race. They
absolutely
people know that I love my pancakes. It's totally like my signature food. But every Friday night, my kids know that we have pancakes for dinner because then I have leftovers for my long run the next morning.
Yes.
And they always taste good. I load it up with syrup, which just makes me feel like a kid again.
Yeah.
And it every time that long run just feels so great when I have pancakes and a whole bunch of syrup as my pre-workout fuel. And then same with the race is I always try and have some pancakes. And you can travel anywhere in the US, I feel like, and pick up a bag of Krusty's pancake mix where you just add water.
Oh yeah.
And easily have an option in your hotel room or Airbnb where you can really load up before a race with some good carbs.
Yeah, and people think about pancakes as you have to make them in pancake form. No, make them in a bowl. Eat a bowl of pancake mix that's microwaved with the syrup. That's still a pancake. It's still the same content. So, at least it's the same food coming in. And
I don't know if I can get behind that. I just I'm really? Such a purist. Yes, I would just have to I don't know. I'll have to maybe trial that of how I could make a pancake form in a microwave.
It's like a mug cake.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. So you're just, microwaving a pancake bowl.
Okay, now I'm going to try this. I'm going to get myself some Krusties today.
Then you just dump maple syrup on it.
Yes. By the time this episode comes out, there should hopefully be on my blog a pancake in a mug recipe.
Yes. I love it. I'm all about it.
A pre-race, hotel friendly, pre-race
or
fuel.
Even college kids, in a dorm room. If they've got, a big game or a big match coming up, being able to, if they probably have a microwave in their dorm room, and maybe they don't have access to the dining hall or they're traveling or whatever it is, pancake bowl it is.
Pancake bowl. I love it.
I think I invented a whole new trend here.
Yes. Now my brain is just, I got so many ideas.
Now I want pancakes. So now I'm really hungry for pancakes.
They're the best. I just love they're so good. I have my own recipes. So if people are listening, if you go to the blog, type in pancakes, my recipe is on there. It's not like a high protein. It's not like a super high carb. I mean, obviously you'd have to have syrup and all that to add up the carbs, but they're just really good. They're a little bit more thinner. So they're almost kind of like not completely like a crepe, but not like that really fluffy thick pancake that people think of. It's kind of in between. So
interesting.
It's delicious.
I'll have to try
it. You add some yogurt to it.
Ooh.
It's very good.
I'm hooked.
Okay, so let's talk about logistics of just ways for people to get in enough fluids. I feel like in cycling it's a little bit easier just because they can carry bottles on them. With triathletes, if they're doing a 70.3 and beyond, I like at least 3 bottle cages on their bike. That's just my personal preference. If they can get 3 on there, if they're a really heavy sweater though, 4 would be ideal. Or having one of those speed fills where you can fill it 40 ounces in it. It's holds a lot of liquid. I do find with cyclists though, the biggest concern is the weight of carrying fluids. But I tell them, I'm dehydration is going to hold you back a lot more than.
I mean, that's very true, especially for someone who is a really heavy sweater, that it's kind of that trade-off of, maybe it's not, in a perfect world, you wouldn't have to carry the fluid, but
in a perfect world, you'd be in the Tour de France and you'd have
same. I would too.
One of those cars where they're and you'd have you'd be the lead, of your team, and people are just handing you bottles whenever you need them. That would be the perfect world, right?
Of course. But, like you said, the dehydration, that makes a significant impact on your time. If you're cramping, you're struggling, you don't have the energy, it probably would have been better having a little bit more weight on your bike.
100% agree. For runners, it gets even more challenging because they often don't want to carry a water bottle. I feel like it's almost like a faux pas to wear a hydration vest as a road runner. But I say screw whatever everyone else thinks, and they're going to think differently when you're PRing in your race and passing them like they're standing still. But there's other things you could do. Like you can set up drop bottles on your route in advance. You could do a loop route where you would rehydrate at your car or at home every few miles. I've had one of my friends I can think of, she would plan her route to go by her friends or family's house, and she'd have them put a bottle in their mailbox, which I thought was really clever. So I feel like if people get really creative in ways that they can get those fluids in, it's just going to set you up for success.
Yeah. And also, depending on where you live, if you're able to kind of run through a place that has some shops or a cafe or something, being able to just grab an extra bottle, and maybe it's not the type of bottle, the exact mixture that you want, that's okay. You can grab plain water and then carrying, like salt capsules, electrolyte capsules, pairing that with it, then you can still make up exactly what you need to hit, but just grabbing a normal plain water bottle from even the gas station.
Yeah, I fully agree. Or learn to tolerate carrying a handheld, right? They do make some comfortable handheld water bottles where there's a little sleeve in there to fit your hand. It'll have a little pouch even for you to fit gels or fuel or even your phone. There's ways that you can make it a little bit easier. And for a lot of people, I think the thought of carrying something throughout their whole run sounds really horrible, but then once they actually do it, they're like, it really wasn't that bad, and I do feel a lot better. I don't get thirsty. They don't feel completely awful at the end of their run. There's things that you just kind of have to
and you have
buckle
more
up
control over it. Definitely it gives you more control. And there's so many things you can't control in sports and endurance races, that if you can control this one small variable, that's still something. And looking at the pros, looking at the championship races, a lot of them are carrying something. And if they're able to do it and still go that fast, it's encouraging that you can, get used to it. Maybe it feels awkward the first couple times, but it can definitely improve. It's that behavioral change, kind of training yourself to get more comfortable with it. And then, like you said, you notice that you're feeling better. That might start to be your comfort water bottle instead.
Yeah, exactly. I love it. Okay, Lexi, this was amazing. I feel like we covered so much good, and that was our goal, right? I said in advance, I want this to be tangible, applicable advice for people to take and apply to their training and races so that they stay safe, they stay healthy, they stay strong in their workouts. Lexi, where can people find more info on precision hydrations, research, and science? Where do they go?
Yeah, so our website is Precision Hydration or Precision Fuel and Hydration .com, and our Instagram is Precision FNH. Definitely check out those two places. We've got a ton of blogs and articles on the website. One of our big things is just education and helping people learn what the science says, how to apply it. Got a lot of interesting interviews on there, just of different athletes doing really cool things and videos. So definitely check out the website, precisionfuelandhydration.com. There's a lot of good case studies as well on there that you can see practically how these, elite athletes and age groupers are practically putting together their strategy and how it worked for them, what they learned from it, what they would do differently. There's a lot of just information and stuff to just really sink your teeth into on the website.
Yeah, I'm always impressed when I look at your staff. You have 3 or 4 sports scientists. You have, Lexi, you work for them. You're their in-house registered dietitian. It's just very cool to me how invested you guys are into the science and creating products that will help people kind of check the boxes in terms of hydration, fueling, electrolytes. making it very easy for them to get what they need in order to perform at the level they want. So I love that.
Yeah.
So keep up the great work, guys.
I appreciate the support.
Yes. I feel like it's just in the past year and a half where I've just seen more and more of my athletes just coming into my program already using precision products. And I will say your gels are really good. I'm kind of like slowly expanding into using gels more exclusively. And your guys' I was like, yeah, I like this. Nice. I don't, is it unflavored? I can't tell like what the flavor is.
It's like a mild neutral flavor. So there's not really a flavor to it.
It's so neutral, but yet at the same time, I'm like, I find
it's easy to get down. And honestly, that's the goal with hot and long races. You don't necessarily want something super strong. So it's really helpful for that flavor fatigue aspect.
I love it. All right. Well, Lexi, thank you again for being here and sharing your expertise. This was really fun to just talk with another sports dietitian and just nerd out on all of this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I so appreciate it.
Holy moly. That was an amazing interview. Here's the thing though. This was all excellent information, but it doesn't mean anything unless you take action with it. People don't see success with information alone. You got to practice it. You got to apply it in order to get the results. All references and notes from this episode will be in the show notes. Make sure you've hit that follow button for the podcast, given it a review. It really helps me continue to grow this program and bring on more amazing guests. I want to thank you again for joining me on another episode of the Endurance Eats podcast. And remember, when it comes to nutrition, it's all about finding what works best for you. I'll see you soon in the next episode.